Hi guys, please do subscribe for daily contents like this. Let's dive into an interesting topic tonight. In the medieval world, many actions that appear harmless or even trivial by modern standards were treated as grave offences, not because of their inherent danger, but because they threatened social order, religious authority, or feudal control, and the consequences could be horrifyingly final. A poorly chosen word, a missed obligation, or a moment of desperation could spiral into accusations that carried the ultimate punishment. One such crime was poaching a rabbit or deer from a lord's forest, an act that today might be dismissed as survival or hunger. Driven theft, but in medieval Europe was considered a direct attack on noble privilege. Forests were symbols of power, and killing game without permission challenged the hierarchy itself, leading not only to imprisonment, but sometimes execution, mutilation, or death from exposure after public punishment. Similarly, cutting down a tree or collecting fallen wood could be labelled theft if the land belonged to the wrong authority, even if the offender only sought warmth or shelter. Another seemingly minor act was failing to show proper deference. Forgetting to bow, remove a hat, or address a superior correctly could be interpreted as defiance, especially during periods of unrest. And defiance was often treated as treason in miniature, punishable by torture or death to make an example of the offender. Speech itself was dangerous. Careless jokes, rumours, or complaints about taxes, food shortages, or local officials could be framed as sedition or heresy, especially when the church and state were deeply intertwined. A farmer muttering that God seemed unjust during a famine could be accused of blasphemy, a charge that frequently ended at the stake, while a tavern conversation repeating hearsay about a king's weakness might be enough to bring the gallows. Even silence could be fatal. Refusing to answer questions in a court, often out of fear or confusion, might be seen as guilt or contempt, resulting in brutal coercion such as pressing, where victims were slowly crushed under stones until they spoke or died. Clothing choices also carried lethal risk. Wearing fabrics, colours, or styles reserved for nobility violated sumptuary laws designed to enforce class boundaries, and while some punishments were fines, repeated offences or refusal to comply could escalate into imprisonment and death, particularly if authorities suspected broader disobedience. Economic survival was equally perilous. Baking bread that was too small, watering down ale, or selling goods at the wrong price could be treated as fraud, and public punishments, like the pillory, exposed offenders to violence, disease, and starvation, sometimes killing them indirectly, but no less certainly. Women were especially vulnerable, as everyday behaviours could be reframed as moral crimes. Midwives, herbalists, or widows living alone could attract suspicion simply for existing outside male control, and an accusation of witchcraft, often rooted in jealousy, fear, or misfortune, required little evidence to justify execution. Even domestic disputes could turn deadly. Shouting at a spouse or neighbour might be labelled disorderly conduct, but if the wrong person felt challenged, it could be recast as an insult to honour or authority, leading to harsh penalties. Children were not exempt either. Stealing food, skipping church, or playing games deemed immoral could result in corporal punishment so severe that it caused permanent injury or death, justified as moral correction. Religious life offered no refuge, as failing to attend church, breaking fasts, or observing rituals incorrectly could be treated as signs of heresy. And heresy was considered worse than murder because it endangered souls and social unity. Once accused, Medieval justice offered little protection. Trials were brief, evidence was often irrelevant, and confessions extracted under torture were accepted as truth, meaning that even innocent people could be condemned for acts that barely register as wrongdoing today. Execution methods themselves were meant to reinforce fear. Hanging, burning, beheading, or being broken on the wheel were public spectacles designed to warn others that obedience mattered more than intent. In this world, the line between life and death was thin and arbitrary, shaped not by fairness, but by power, tradition, and fear. What makes these crimes so disturbing is not only the brutality of the punishments, but the realization that ordinary people, hungry, tired, frightened, or simply careless, could lose their lives for actions that modern societies would barely notice. Medieval law was less about justice and more about control, and death was not reserved for monstrous acts, but used as a tool to enforce obedience in a fragile and unequal world, where survival itself often meant walking constantly on the edge of fatal transgression. In many regions, even movement itself could become a fatal mistake, as travelling without proper permission or documentation was often viewed with deep suspicion. A peasant leaving their village in search of work, food, or safety might be accused of vagrancy, a crime rooted less in harm and more in fear of disorder. Vagrants were believed to spread disease, crime, and rebellion, and authorities often punished them harshly to deter others from abandoning their assigned place in the social structure. Arrest could lead to whipping, branding, forced labour, or execution, especially during times of famine or plague, when fear ruled decision-making. Crossing a boundary, stepping onto the wrong lord's land, walking through a restricted road, or entering a town after curfew, could trigger similar outcomes, not because the act itself was dangerous, but because boundaries symbolized control, and violating them challenged the invisible lines that held medieval society together. Even hospitality could turn deadly. Sheltering a stranger without permission might be interpreted as aiding a criminal or spy, and households accused of such kindness could face collective punishment. Medical ignorance also transformed harmless behavior into lethal crimes. During outbreaks of disease, especially plagues, people who appeared sick, behaved oddly, or simply survived when others died could be accused of deliberately spreading illness. Touching a well feeding animals or washing clothes in the wrong place might be framed as poisoning, a charge that almost always led to execution. In desperate attempts to explain suffering, communities searched for scapegoats, and everyday actions were reinterpreted through paranoia and fear. Grief itself was dangerous. Public mourning that seemed excessive or unnatural could attract suspicion of witchcraft or guilt, particularly for women, whose emotional expression was closely scrutinized. Likewise, laughter at inappropriate moments, nervous behavior, or failure to cry could all be twisted into evidence of moral corruption. Debt was another silent killer. Borrowing small sums to survive a poor harvest or illness could spiral into accusations of fraud or breach of trust. If repayment failed, medieval prisons were not designed for rehabilitation. They were filthy, overcrowded, and deadly, and many people sentenced for minor financial disputes died of disease, starvation, or neglect before any formal execution was necessary. Even attempting to negotiate or protest unfair debts could be treated as defiance of authority, escalating the punishment. Markets, meant to sustain life, became stages of fatal error. Using the wrong weights, measuring grain incorrectly, or trading on an unauthorized day could result in punishment so severe that survival was unlikely. Honor culture made words sharper than weapons. Insults, even accidental ones, could provoke legal action or personal vengeance supported by the courts. Calling someone a liar, questioning lineage, or mocking appearance might seem trivial, but such words attacked reputation, which in medieval society was a form of survival currency. Loss of honor could mean loss of protection, and accusations of slander could lead to trials that ended in execution, particularly if the insult involved clergy or nobility. In some cases, simply failing to defend one's honor, remaining silent after an accusation, was seen as admission of guilt, again showing how restraint itself could become deadly. Time also worked against the accused. Legal delays were not safeguards, they were punishments. Being held while awaiting judgment could be more dangerous than the sentence itself, as weeks or months in confinement often ended in death from illness or mistreatment. Appeals rarely helped common people, and mercy depended entirely on the mood or interests of those in power. A harmless act committed during a calm period might be ignored, while the same act during unrest could be punished with death to restore a sense of control. Justice shifted with politics, weather, harvests, and rumor. What ties all these stories together is the absence of proportionality. Medieval law was not built to weigh intent, context, or humanity. It was built to preserve hierarchy. Death was not the last resort, but a warning, a message carved into bodies and displayed in public spaces. Harmless actions became symbols of imagined threats, and individuals were sacrificed to maintain the illusion of order. For most people, survival required constant vigilance, obedience, and invisibility, because standing out, even accidentally, could mean crossing an unseen line. In such a world, the most dangerous crimes were not acts of violence or cruelty, but ordinary human behaviors performed at the wrong moment, in the wrong place, or under the wrong authority, turning daily life itself into a gamble, where the smallest mistake could cost everything. Another layer of danger lay in communal responsibility, where an individual's harmless action could doom an entire household or village. Medieval law often operated on collective guilt. Even leisure and rest were closely watched, and enjoying oneself at the wrong time could invite deadly consequences. Games, music, dancing, or drinking outside approved festivals were often condemned as signs of moral decay. Playing dice, cards, or local games might seem harmless entertainment, but authorities associated such pastimes with gambling, idleness, and rebellion. Repeated accusations of wasting time could lead to severe punishment, because time itself was seen as belonging to God the Lord or the employer. A labourer resting during mandated work hours, even from exhaustion or illness, might be charged with disobedience. And in extreme cases, this refusal to work was treated as a threat to economic order rather than a human need, leading to imprisonment or death. Singing the wrong song or performing an unapproved story could also be dangerous, especially if lyrics were interpreted as mocking the church or nobility. Even unintentionally, food and hospitality laws carried similar risks. Sharing a meal with the wrong person could be interpreted as alliance or conspiracy. Eating meat on forbidden religious days, even out of ignorance, could be labelled sacrilege. Repeated violations were treated as open defiance of divine authority, which medieval courts considered more dangerous than physical violence. Starving people who broke fasting rules during famines were sometimes punished brutally, as authorities feared that allowing exceptions would weaken control over the population. Cooking smells alone could attract suspicion if they suggested rule-breaking, turning private survival into public accusation. Justice also relied heavily on reputation, meaning that once a person was labelled troublesome, nearly any harmless act could be twisted into proof of guilt. A known troublemaker fetching water late at night might be accused of plotting. A widow walking alone after sunset could be suspected of immoral behaviour. Reputation was difficult to escape, and accusations compounded until execution seemed inevitable. This created a self-fulfilling system, where survival depended on remaining socially invisible, because standing out, even for kindness, intelligence, or independence, was dangerous. Religious fear amplified this danger further. Dreams, visions, or unusual beliefs, shared casually, could be interpreted as divine messages or demonic influence. People who spoke about strange dreams or questioned religious explanations for suffering might be accused of heresy. Even curiosity was dangerous, asking why certain rituals existed or why God allowed disasters could be framed as doubt, and doubt was seen as contagious. Executing one doubter served as a warning to many others to stop asking questions. Nature itself became a legal trap. Cutting across fields, fishing in streams, or gathering herbs were all regulated by ownership and tradition. A person could be executed, not for harming the land, but for ignoring invisible claims over it. Animals caused danger too. If livestock wandered into protected land, the owner could be punished severely, regardless of intent. In some cases, animals themselves were put on trial, but the humans associated with them often suffered worse fates. Accident and misfortune blurred into crime, reinforcing the idea that survival required perfect obedience to rules few fully understood. What makes these punishments so chilling is how normalized they were. Death was not always seen as cruelty, but as correction, purification, or divine justice. Communities learned to accept executions for minor acts as part of life, just as common as births or harvests. Over time, fear shaped behavior so deeply that people policed themselves and each other, reporting neighbors not out of malice but out of self-preservation. Mercy was rare, and forgiveness even rarer, because authority thrived on fear more than fairness. In this environment, harmless acts were dangerous because they reminded rulers and institutions that humans are unpredictable. Laughter, movement, curiosity, hunger, and compassion could not be fully controlled, so they were punished when they appeared to escape regulation. Medieval crime was less about what was done and more about what it symbolized: independence, disorder, or doubt. Death, used freely and publicly, was the ultimate reminder that life itself was conditional. To live was to obey and to step even slightly outside expectation. By speaking, resting, helping, or surviving in unapproved ways was to risk becoming another silent example carved into history by a world that valued control above humanity. Another silent danger lay in curiosity itself, because asking questions about law, faith, land, or authority was often interpreted not as a search for understanding, but as a challenge. A peasant wondering aloud why a tax had increased, why grain was exported during famine, or why certain families held privileges others could quickly be labelled rebellious. Curiosity threatened the illusion that hierarchy was natural and divinely ordained. Once that illusion cracked, punishment followed swiftly. Many executions were not responses to crimes at all, but to the fear that ideas might spread. Killing one questioner was easier than answering a question. Even memory could be fatal. Remembering old customs, repeating stories from a previous ruler's reign, or recalling times when life seemed fairer could be interpreted as nostalgia for rebellion. Authorities feared comparison because comparison encouraged judgment. Songs, folk tales, and oral histories were watched closely, and storytellers who described heroic resistance or unjust lords sometimes vanished after performances. What appeared to be harmless tradition was treated as ideological contamination, punishable by death. Silence, too, could condemn. Witnessing a crime and failing to report, it was often treated as complicity, regardless of fear or powerlessness. A villager who saw a theft, a fight, or forbidden behavior, and chose to stay quiet, might later face execution if the truth emerged. Fear created betrayal, and betrayal fed fear, trapping communities in cycles where survival required turning against one another. Loyalty to people was dangerous. Loyalty to authority was mandatory. The body itself was regulated. Illness, deformity, or unusual strength could provoke suspicion. Someone who survived disease when others died might be accused of unnatural protection. Someone unusually strong or resilient might be suspected of dark influence. Healing quickly, not healing at all, or healing in the wrong way could all become evidence of guilt. The medieval mind sought meaning in everything, and when fear dominated, meaning turned lethal. Even death did not end danger. Families of the executed often lost property, status, and protection, sometimes being driven from their homes or left to starve. Children inherited suspicion, becoming targets themselves later in life. A single harmless act could ripple across generations, transforming entire bloodlines into outcasts. Punishment was not about correcting behavior. It was about erasing disruption completely. What emerges from all of this is a world where humanity itself was the crime. Hunger, curiosity, exhaustion, kindness, grief, joy, ordinary human experiences were dangerous because they resisted control. Medieval justice did not ask whether an action harmed someone. It asked whether it threatened order. And when order felt fragile, death became the simplest answer. These crimes seem harmless today, not because people were different then, but because power defined harm differently. The true danger was never the act itself, but the reminder that people could act, think, feel, and survive beyond the narrow limits imposed on them. In such a world, death was not reserved for the violent or cruel. It waited patiently for anyone who stepped slightly out of line, proving that in medieval society, the most unforgivable offence was being human in the wrong way, at the wrong time, under the wrong authority. Fear also lived in paperwork and procedure, because misunderstanding a rule was treated the same as deliberately breaking it. Most people could not read. Laws were spoken rather than written, and regulations changed depending on season, ruler, or crisis. A harmless mistake, entering a town on the wrong day, selling goods after sunset, using an outdated measure, or following an old custom that had quietly been banned, could lead to arrest. Claiming ignorance offered no protection. Ignorance was considered negligence, and negligence was a moral failure. The law did not exist to guide people safely, but to catch them when they stumbled. In this way, everyday life became a minefield, where survival depended on guessing invisible expectations correctly. Natural disasters intensified this cruelty. After floods, fires, or failed harvests, authorities often searched for someone to blame. Harmless acts committed before the disaster were re-examined with suspicion. A person who argued with a neighbor weeks earlier might be accused of causing divine punishment. Someone who skipped church once could be blamed for God's anger toward the entire village. The need for explanation outweighed truth, and execution became a ritual meant to restore balance, even when it solved nothing. Killing the guilty reassured the living that suffering had a cause, and that cause could be removed. Gender and age offered no protection. Elderly people who could no longer work were often accused of being burdens or parasites, and accusations of idleness or witchcraft followed easily. Children who spoke out of turn, repeated adult conversations, or displayed unusual intelligence could be punished harshly for disrespect or suspicion of corruption. Youth was not innocence. It was unpredictability, and unpredictability frightened authority. Harmless curiosity in a child could be reframed as defiance. Another often forgotten danger was accuracy itself. Being too precise, remembering details clearly, recounting events consistently, or speaking with confidence could raise suspicion. Medieval authorities often expected confusion, fear, and contradiction from the innocent. Someone who spoke calmly, clearly, or logically under accusation might be seen as rehearsed or deceitful. Intelligence was unsettling in a system that relied on obedience rather than understanding. Clarity could look like manipulation, and articulation could become evidence of guilt. The concept of forgiveness was also tightly controlled. Forgiving the wrong person could be fatal. If someone forgave an offender before judgment, it could be interpreted as undermining justice. If they forgave after punishment, it might be seen as questioning the punishment's legitimacy. Mercy was permitted only when authorized. Unapproved forgiveness suggested moral independence, and moral independence was intolerable. In a system built on fear, mercy was dangerous because it reminded people that cruelty was a choice, not a necessity. There was danger in restraint as well. Choosing not to participate in violence, mockery, or punishment could draw attention. A person who refused to throw stones, shout accusations, or cheer during executions risked being noticed. Silence during communal cruelty could be interpreted as sympathy for the condemned. Participation became proof of loyalty, and refusal became suspicion. In this way, harmless non-action could be just as deadly as overt defiance. Knowledge passed quietly was another threat. Teaching a child to read, sharing herbal remedies, explaining old customs, or recounting alternative interpretations of faith could all be framed as spreading forbidden knowledge. Education outside approved structures was feared because it created independent thought. Even when intentions were kind, the act of teaching could be reclassified as corruption. Death removed not just the teacher, but the possibility of learning beyond control. The body's involuntary responses often betrayed people. Sweating, trembling, stuttering, or avoiding eye contact were natural reactions to fear, yet they were treated as signs of guilt. The legal system assumed that innocence looked calm and guilt looked nervous, ignoring how terror affected the human body. This misunderstanding turned fear itself into evidence, ensuring that once accused, survival became unlikely. Even gratitude carried risk. Thanking the wrong person, expressing loyalty too openly, or praising authority excessively could later be used as proof of alignment with a fallen figure. When power shifted, yesterday's gratitude became today's crime. Words meant to protect could return years later as justification for death. Memory did not fade, it waited. What makes this world so unsettling is how little agency people truly had. Choice existed, but every option carried danger. Speak or stay silent, help or step away, obey or hesitate. None guaranteed safety. Medieval punishment thrived on this uncertainty, because uncertainty kept people compliant. When no path feels safe, fear becomes the guide. Over time, fear reshaped not just behavior, but identity. People learned to flatten themselves, to hide strong opinions, mute emotions, and avoid attachment. Life became narrower, quieter, and smaller. The law did not merely punish acts, it sculpted personalities. Those who survived longest were often those who disappeared most completely. These stories reveal that medieval death was rarely about correcting wrongs. It was about maintaining a fragile sense of order in a world plagued by disease, scarcity, and unpredictability. Instead of addressing those realities, power responded by controlling people. Harmless acts became crimes because they were easier to punish than famine, plague, or fear itself. And so the pattern remains unbroken. Ordinary human behavior was never the problem, but it became the excuse. Hunger, curiosity, kindness, hope, grief, and intelligence all threatened systems that depended on silence and submission. Death was not the consequence of cruelty. It was the consequence of being human in a world that feared humanity. That is why medieval crimes feel so disturbing today. Not because the people were more violent than us, but because the system was built to treat life as expendable. In that world, survival was not guaranteed by goodness or innocence, but by invisibility. And for countless people, even that was not enough. There was also the danger of standing still while the world moved, because stagnation itself could be interpreted as defiance. Medieval societies expected visible productivity, visible devotion, visible obedience. A person who changed too slowly, who clung to old habits, old speech, old rituals, could be accused of refusing progress as defined by authority. Tradition was only safe when it aligned with power. The moment tradition conflicted with new decrees, those who upheld it became criminals overnight. Harmless loyalty to the past became a capital offense in the present. Even survival strategies were morally judged. Someone who adapted too well to hardship, finding food when others starved, avoiding illness when others died, could attract suspicion. Survival was supposed to be shared, and anyone who appeared unusually resilient disrupted the narrative of collective suffering. Instead of being admired, such people were feared. Their endurance demanded explanation, and explanation often took the form of accusation. In a world desperate for meaning, living longer than expected could be dangerous. Authority also distrusted neutrality. People who refused to take sides during disputes, conflicts, or religious divisions were often punished more harshly than those who chose incorrectly. Neutrality suggested independence of thought, and independence threatened control. Choosing nothing was treated as choosing opposition. A harmless desire to avoid conflict could end in death simply because it denied authority the validation of obedience. The body's needs were another liability. Hunger, exhaustion, illness, and pain were expected to be endured silently. Complaining about them could be interpreted as ingratitude or rebellion. Requesting rest, food, or relief implied that the system was failing, and failure was unacceptable. Even asking for help could be reframed as accusation. In this way, suffering became mandatory, and expressing it became criminal. Memory of injustice was especially dangerous. People who remembered unfair punishments, wrongful executions, or abuses of power carried seen and unseen risk. Speaking about these memories could be labeled slander or sedition. Remaining silent while remembering could still alter behavior, and altered behavior attracted attention. Forgetting was safer than remembering, and death often followed those who could not forget. There was also the danger of being ordinary at the wrong moment. When fear peaked during plagues, wars, or unrest, authorities often needed to act decisively to project strength. Executions increased, not because crime increased, but because anxiety did. In such times, anyone could become a symbol. The harmless were often chosen precisely because they were replaceable. Killing the innocent sent a clearer message than punishing the guilty, because it proved that no one was truly safe. Over time, these patterns hollowed out the meaning of justice entirely. Law ceased to be a shield and became a weapon. People stopped expecting protection and focused only on avoidance. Life narrowed to routines designed not for fulfillment but for survival. Creativity faded, trust eroded, community weakened. Fear did what famine and disease could not. It reshaped the human spirit. What is most chilling is how efficiently this system justified itself. Each execution reinforced the belief that danger had been prevented. Each death made the next one easier. Violence became proof of order, and order became proof of righteousness. Questioning this logic was impossible, because those who questioned it disappeared. In the medieval world, harmless acts did not lead to death, because people were cruel by nature, but because power was fragile. When systems fear collapse, they punish deviation, not harm. They kill reminders of uncertainty. They erase what they cannot control, and so the list of medieval crimes grows endlessly, not because people committed more wrongdoing, but because being alive produced infinite opportunities for accusation. Speaking, resting, helping, remembering, hoping, surviving, each was a risk because each affirmed humanity. In a society built on fear, humanity itself was the ultimate threat. That is the final, unsettling truth behind medieval crimes that seem harmless today. They reveal not a past obsessed with justice, but a world terrified of losing control. A world where death was cheaper than understanding, easier than compassion, and more reliable than fairness. And in that world, countless lives ended not with screams or resistance, but with quiet confusion. Never fully knowing which harmless act had crossed the invisible line. Another often unseen danger lay in expectation of gratitude. Medieval authority demanded not only obedience, but visible thankfulness for being ruled. A person who accepted hardship without complaint, but also without praise, could be viewed as ungrateful, and ingratitude was interpreted as resentment waiting to turn into rebellion. Gratitude had to be performed, not felt. Failing to express it publicly, through words, gestures, or submission, could mark someone as inwardly disloyal. In this way, emotional performance became a survival requirement, and sincerity was irrelevant. there was also the threat of being useful at the wrong time. When crises passed, those who had been essential, organizers, protectors, outspoken leaders, often became liabilities. There was also the danger of coincidence, because medieval justice often confused correlation with guilt. If a person was present near a crime scene, disaster, or accusation, presence alone could become proof, being nearby when something went wrong. When a fire started, when a child fell ill, when an animal died, was enough to attract blame. The human mind, desperate for order, preferred a flawed explanation to uncertainty. Someone had to be responsible, and responsibility was assigned not by evidence, but by convenience. In this way, chance encounters and bad timing quietly sentenced people to death. Expectation itself became a trap. People were not only judged by what they did, but by what they were expected to do. A man who failed to intervene in a fight could be accused of cowardice or complicity. A woman who spoke during conflict could be accused of incitement. A person who reacted too slowly, too quickly, too calmly, or too emotionally could all be judged guilty depending on circumstance. There was no correct response, only safer ones, and safety shifted constantly. Ritual confession added another layer of cruelty. Under pressure, exhaustion, hunger, or torture, people confessed to crimes they did not understand or did not commit. Once confessed, the system no longer required logic. Retractions were ignored. Truth became irrelevant the moment fear entered the room. Some confessed simply to end pain, others out of belief that suffering was divinely deserved. In both cases, harmless lives ended not because of action, but because fear broke the will to resist. The idea of collective memory made survival even harder. Communities remembered accusations longer than innocence. Even when someone escaped execution, suspicion lingered. That suspicion shaped how others treated them, denied them work, withheld help, and isolated them socially. Many died slowly after punishment, not by law, but by abandonment. The system did not need to kill everyone directly. It only needed to mark them. Time blurred guilt and innocence. Long imprisonments without trial weakened bodies and minds. People emerged sick, broken, or changed, and that change itself became evidence of corruption. A person altered by suffering was seen as dangerous, unstable, or morally damaged. Survival, ironically, became proof that punishment had not gone far enough. What made medieval punishment especially devastating was that it did not require hatred. Ordinary people enforced it not out of cruelty, but out of fear and habit. Guards, judges, neighbours, and witnesses often believed they were doing what was necessary. The system functioned smoothly because it convinced people that violence was responsibility and silence was safety. When killing becomes routine, conscience adapts. In this world, the smallest divergence mattered. Standing still when others knelt, speaking when others were silent, or remaining silent when others spoke, could all draw attention. Attention was danger. Once seen, a person became a story, and stories invited interpretation. Interpretation invited accusation. Accusation invited death. Over time, fear shaped not only behavior but identity. People learned to suppress personality, ambition, and individuality. They became careful versions of themselves, trained to survive rather than live. The cost of this survival was invisible, but immense. Lost creativity, lost trust, lost humanity. Death was not only physical, it happened slowly, inside, long before execution. This is why medieval crimes that seem harmless today feel so disturbing. They reveal a world where morality was replaced by obedience, where justice served fear rather than fairness, and where life was fragile not because of nature alone, but because of systems built to control it. People did not die because they were dangerous. They died because danger was defined by power, not harm. In the end, the medieval world teaches a harsh lesson. When order is valued above humanity, even ordinary existence becomes a crime. Eating, speaking, helping, resting, hoping, each carried risk because they reminded authority that people were still human. And in a society that feared humanity more than injustice, death became the simplest answer to every uncomfortable question, leaving behind a history where harmless acts echo louder than the crimes that supposedly justified them. There was also the danger of expectation tied to fate and belief, because medieval society often assumed that misfortune revealed moral truth. If someone experienced repeated bad luck, lost children, failed harvests, illness, or accidents, people began to suspect that something about them was wrong. Suffering was not seen as random, it was interpreted as a sign. A person marked by hardship could slowly become marked by guilt, even if their actions were blameless. Eventually, accusation followed, not because of what they did, but because of what had happened to them. In this way, life itself could testify against you. Time of day mattered too. Being outside too early or too late could be interpreted as suspicious. Dawn and night were associated with secrecy, crime, and evil forces. A person fetching water before sunrise, walking home after dark, or tending animals at unusual hours could be accused of wrongdoing simply for moving when others slept. Necessity did not matter. Explanation did not matter. Visibility at the wrong hour was enough to invite fatal suspicion. Authority also feared inconsistency. People who changed their behavior, became quieter, more devout, more withdrawn, or more outspoken, were seen as unstable. Change suggested influence, and influence suggested corruption. Growth, healing, or personal transformation could be interpreted as manipulation or hidden intent. In a world that valued predictability over truth, consistency mattered more than character. Remaining the same was safer than becoming better. Even emotions were regulated. Excessive joy could be read as mockery of suffering. Excessive sadness could be read as guilt or divine punishment. Anger suggested rebellion. Calm suggested arrogance. There was no safe emotional range, only less dangerous ones. The body betrayed people constantly, reacting in ways they could not fully control, and those reactions were used against them. Humanity itself became evidence. Language trapped people further. Many laws were vague by design, allowing wide interpretation. This gave authority flexibility to punish whenever it felt necessary. A rule against disorderly conduct or improper behavior could mean almost anything. Once language loses precision, justice loses limits. Harmless actions became crimes, not because they fit the law, but because the law could be bent around them. There was also the burden of survival guilt. Those who survived disasters, plagues, famines, fires, were sometimes accused simply because they remained alive when others did not. Survival demanded explanation. Instead of chance, people searched for cause, and cause required blame. Living became suspicious. The longer one survived hardship, the more likely suspicion followed. Over generations, this fear reshaped culture so deeply that people stopped imagining alternatives. Harsh punishment for small acts felt natural, even necessary. People learned to accept cruelty as order and obedience as morality. Resistance faded, not because people agreed, but because fear erased the language needed to imagine justice differently. When death enforces silence long enough, silence begins to sound like truth. What ultimately binds all these stories is not cruelty alone, but insecurity. Medieval systems were fragile, economically, medically, politically, spiritually. They responded to that fragility by tightening control, narrowing acceptable behavior, and treating deviation as existential threat. Harmless acts became dangerous because they exposed how little control truly existed. These deaths were not accidents of history, they were patterns. They show what happens when power fears unpredictability more than injustice, when order is valued more than life, and when humanity is treated as a flaw to be corrected. People did not die because they failed morally, but because systems built on fear cannot tolerate ordinary human existence. And so the tragedy deepens. Medieval crimes that seem harmless today were never really crimes at all. They were moments where life slipped outside expectation, where hunger, curiosity, kindness, exhaustion, memory, or hope appeared unregulated. In a world that demanded absolute control, those moments were unforgivable. Death followed not as punishment, but as reassurance. Reassurance that fear still ruled, that order still mattered more than mercy, and that being human remained the most dangerous act of all. Another hidden danger lay in resemblance, because looking like someone else could cost a life. Facial features, body shape, scars, or even hairstyle could link an innocent person to a wanted criminal or heretic. Without photographs, reliable records, or forensic proof, resemblance carried weight equal to guilt. Protest meant little. Once someone matched a description, identity hardened around accusation. In this way, a face itself could become evidence, and death could arrive, not because of action, but because of similarity. Routine obedience rituals also created traps. People were expected to react instantly to authority, stand, kneel, remove head coverings, or step aside. A delayed response caused by distraction, fatigue, or hearing difficulty could be interpreted as refusal. Refusal, even imagined, was often treated as deliberate insult. Many people were punished not for defiance, but for being humanly slow. The law assumed perfect attention, bodies failed to deliver it. Even humor carried lethal risk. Sarcasm, irony, or playful exaggeration were easily misunderstood in rigid systems that lacked tolerance for ambiguity. A joke told to relieve tension. Another subtle danger lay in imitation, because copying behavior, even innocently, could be fatal. Wearing clothing similar to a noble, speaking with learned language, or adopting gestures associated with higher status might be interpreted as mockery or ambition. Ambition among the lower classes was frightening, not because it harmed anyone, but because it suggested movement in a society built on immobility. A person who appeared to forget their place could be punished severely to remind everyone else where theirs was. What looked like aspiration or admiration became, in the eyes of authority, a threat to the natural order, and death was used to push people back into invisibility. Dreams of improvement were dangerous as well. Talking about a better life, imagining fairer systems, or expressing hope for change could be framed as dissatisfaction. Dissatisfaction implied comparison, and comparison implied judgment. Medieval systems survived on the belief that suffering was normal, divinely intended, and unavoidable. Anyone who hinted otherwise risked punishment for undermining acceptance. Hope itself could be treated as rebellion, especially when spoken aloud among the poor. Even routine acts of cleanliness or self-care could attract suspicion. Bathing too often, grooming carefully, or maintaining one's appearance beyond expectations might be interpreted as vanity or moral corruption. Conversely, dirt and poverty could be seen as signs of moral failure. There was no safe position. The body had to look exactly as expected, no better, no worse, or risk accusation. Existing outside narrow norms, even unintentionally, made a person visible, and visibility was always dangerous. Communication errors carried lethal weight. Mispronouncing a prayer, misunderstanding an instruction, or responding incorrectly to a question during interrogation could seal a fate. Stress, fear, and confusion were not considered mitigating factors. They were considered evidence of guilt. A trembling voice or hesitation could be interpreted as deceit. The human body's natural response to fear became proof that fear was deserved. Travel stories and foreign knowledge were equally risky. Someone who had been elsewhere, another town, region, or country, might bring back ideas, habits, or accents that marked them as different. Difference implied contamination. Foreignness, even within the same kingdom, was associated with disorder. People who had seen alternatives to local life could inspire comparison simply by existing, and that made them dangerous. Sometimes execution was less about punishment and more about preventing influence. What makes all of this especially disturbing is how ordinary people participated. Fear turned neighbors into witnesses, families into informants, and communities into instruments of punishment. Reporting others became a survival strategy. Refusing to report was seen as guilt. Over time, people learned to preempt danger by accusing first. In this way, harmless acts multiplied into accusations, not because they were dangerous, but because fear demanded constant sacrifice. The system did not collapse under this cruelty because cruelty stabilized it. Death simplified complexity. It ended questions, erased exceptions, and restored silence. Each execution reminded everyone watching that survival depended not on fairness, but on compliance. Over time, this lesson became instinctive. People learned to live smaller lives, speak fewer words, and feel less openly. In the medieval world, law did not ask whether an action caused harm. It asked whether it challenged control. Harmless acts were dangerous precisely because they were human, and humanity could not be perfectly regulated. When systems demand absolute order, ordinary life becomes criminal by default, and so medieval crimes that seem harmless today were never truly about crime. They were about fear. Fear of hunger, fear of disorder, fear of questioning, fear of change. Death was the answer to that fear, used again and again, until it became routine. What remains is the unsettling realization that these people did not die because they were evil, reckless, or cruel, but because they lived within a world that could not tolerate normal human behavior. In that world, survival was not a right. It was a temporary permission, granted only to those who stayed silent, still, and unseen. Another quiet threat came from being useful in the wrong way. Skilled individuals, smiths, healers, scribes, or builders, were sometimes punished not because they caused harm, but because their usefulness made them influential. Influence outside official control was dangerous. A healer whose remedies worked too well could be accused of unnatural knowledge. A scribe who could read aloud might spread ideas unintentionally. A craftsman admired by many could gather respect that rivaled authority. In such cases, skill itself became suspicious. Execution removed not only the person, but the possibility of independent influence. Even patients could be misread, enduring suffering calmly, accepting punishment without protest, or showing unusual emotional restraint could provoke suspicion. Authorities expected fear, tears, or submission. A person who remained composed was sometimes believed to be hiding guilt, arrogance, or secret strength. Strength without permission was intolerable. What might appear to modern eyes as dignity could be interpreted as defiance, and defiance, even silent, was lethal. Mistakes in ritualized life were especially dangerous, because medieval society was built on repetition. Bells rang at fixed hours, prayers followed exact wording, gestures had precise meanings. Forgetting a line, standing in the wrong place, or moving at the wrong moment could be seen as deliberate disruption. Ritual was order made visible, and disrupting it, even accidentally, felt like tearing at the fabric of reality. Punishment restored the illusion that order was intact. The idea of normal was extremely narrow, and anyone who drifted outside it risked death. People who laughed too loudly, spoke too little, worked too slowly, or worked too eagerly could all be marked as strange. Strangeness attracted attention, and attention invited accusation. Medieval survival depended less on virtue than on blending in perfectly. The safest person was not the kindest or most honest, but the least noticeable. Even memory of kindness could be dangerous. If someone helped another who was later accused of a crime, that past kindness could be reinterpreted as proof of conspiracy. Feeding a hungry neighbor, offering shelter years earlier, or defending someone verbally could resurface as evidence. Good deeds were not erased by time. They waited quietly until power needed justification. In this way, compassion carried long shadows. The ultimate cruelty of this system was that it taught people to fear themselves. Natural impulses, curiosity, empathy, hope, pride had to be constantly suppressed. People learned to doubt their instincts, silence their thoughts, and control their expressions. Survival required internal policing long before external punishment arrived. The law lived inside people, shaping behavior through fear, even when no authority was present. What makes these medieval deaths so haunting is not only their brutality, but their banality. There was rarely a single dramatic moment of wrongdoing. Instead, death crept in through ordinary life, through habits, words, gestures, needs. The crime was often invisible until it was named, and once named, it became unavoidable. In the end, medieval justice was not about protecting life, but about managing anxiety. When the world felt unstable, because of disease, famine, war, or uncertainty, authority responded by narrowing the definition of acceptable behavior until almost no one could safely fit inside it. Death became the final correction, the simplest way to restore silence. These crimes seem harmless now because we measure harm by injury and intent. Medieval society measured harm by disruption and fear, and in a world where fear ruled law, even breathing a little too freely could become a reason to die. There was also the ever-present danger of being misunderstood, because medieval life left little room for clarification. Accents varied from village to village, gestures carried local meanings, and tone could be misread easily, especially under stress. A poorly phrased sentence, a misunderstood hand movement, or a nervous laugh could be interpreted as mockery, lying, or disrespect. Once suspicion formed, it rarely faded. Explanation was often taken as further proof of guilt, because defending oneself implied resistance. In such a system, innocence was fragile and easily overwritten by fear. The passage of time itself could turn harmless acts into crimes. Something done years earlier, an argument, a refusal, a casual remark, could resurface when circumstances changed. Old grudges were dangerous because medieval justice often relied on testimony rather than evidence. A neighbour seeking favour, revenge, or protection might revive a long-forgotten incident and reshape it into a crime. Memory was flexible, and truth was secondary to usefulness. A peaceful life could end suddenly because the past was never truly past. Even compliance offered no guarantee of safety. Obeying every visible rule did not protect against invisible expectations. Authorities often punished unpredictably to reinforce fear, ensuring that obedience never became comfortable. People were expected not only to follow laws, but to anticipate moods, politics, and unspoken boundaries. Failing to sense these shifts was treated as negligence or arrogance. Survival depended on intuition more than morality, and intuition failed often. Illness amplified vulnerability. Fever could cause confusion, slurred speech, or strange behavior, all of which could be interpreted as signs of possession, guilt, or moral weakness. There was also the quiet terror of timing, because doing the right thing at the wrong moment could be just as deadly as doing the wrong thing entirely. Helping someone during an investigation, feeding a prisoner, or offering shelter during unrest might normally be seen as kindness. But in moments of political tension, these acts were reframed as interference. Mercy itself became suspicious. Authorities believed that compassion weakened discipline, so those who acted humanely could be accused of undermining justice. A loaf of bread passed through bars, a whispered prayer, or a gesture of sympathy toward the condemned could pull an innocent person into the same fate. In this way, fear did not just punish wrongdoing, it punished empathy. Seasonal pressure made this worse. Winter scarcity sharpened cruelty because resources were limited and patience thinner. A harmless mistake in summer might be forgiven, but the same act in winter could lead to execution, simply because society could not afford leniency. During cold months, laws were enforced more brutally, and survival crimes multiplied. People stole not out of greed, but necessity. And necessity was never accepted as an excuse. Hunger was treated as weakness, and weakness was treated as moral failure. Law itself was often contradictory, placing people in impossible positions. One rule demanded obedience to local custom, while another demanded obedience to royal decree. Fulfilling one could violate the other. Refusing a lord's order could be treason. Following it might violate church law. In these conflicts, the powerless always lost. Harmless obedience could become fatal if the authority issuing the command later fell out of favour. people died not for what they did, but for whom they obeyed. Public shame functioned as a slow execution. Being labelled criminal often meant losing access to work, trade, and protection. Once isolated, death followed naturally through starvation, exposure, or violence. The law did not need to kill directly. It only needed to strip away support. Banishment, often considered a lesser punishment, was frequently a delayed death sentence. Being expelled from one's community in a world without safety nets meant wandering until disease, hunger, or execution elsewhere ended life. Fear of chaos justified everything. Rulers believed that if minor offences were not punished harshly, society would collapse. This belief created a feedback loop. Fear of disorder led to brutal punishment. Brutal punishment created resentment and desperation increased disorder. Yet instead of questioning the system, authorities doubled down, using death more freely. Harmless acts became symbols of imagined collapse, and killing the offender became proof that order still existed. The most tragic aspect is how ordinary people internalized this logic. Many came to believe they deserved punishment, that suffering was natural, and that death for small mistakes was the price of existence. This belief made resistance rare and mercy suspect. When executions happened, crowds gathered not only out of fear but acceptance. Death became familiar, routine, almost administrative. In such a world, justice lost all connection to fairness. It became theatre, warning, and control. Harmless actions were never truly harmless because they occurred within a system that treated human unpredictability as a threat. To live safely required erasing oneself, no questions, no deviations, no excess emotion, no visible need. What remains most unsettling is how close this world feels despite its distance in time. The medieval fear of disorder turned everyday life into a constant trial, where survival depended on luck as much as obedience. People did not die because they were cruel or violent, but because systems built on fear cannot tolerate normal human behavior. In that sense, medieval crimes that led to death were not failures of morality, but evidence of a society that believed control mattered more than life itself, and proved it again and again, one harmless act at a time. There was also the danger of being noticed during transition, times when power shifted, rulers died, wars ended, or new laws were announced. During these moments, harmless past behavior could suddenly become lethal. An action that was tolerated under one authority might be condemned under the next, and people were expected to adapt instantly. Old loyalties became crimes overnight. Speaking favourably of a former ruler, displaying outdated symbols, or continuing previous customs could be interpreted as resistance. Many people died, not for doing something wrong, but for failing to predict change quickly enough in a world where information travelled slowly and punishment arrived fast. Names and identity themselves could be dangerous. Having the same name as a known criminal, heretic, or rebel could attract suspicion. Family ties were equally risky. Being related to someone accused of wrongdoing could implicate you automatically. Guilt by association required no action at all. Entire families were punished to prevent future resistance, turning birth itself into a potential crime. In such cases, harmless existence was enough to justify death, because authorities feared not what people had done, but what they might do someday. Festivals, which were meant to offer release from hardship, carried their own risks. Celebrations often blurred social boundaries, encouraging laughter, drinking, and mixing across classes. Authorities tolerated these events cautiously, and when disorder occurred, punishment followed harshly. Someone dancing too freely, mocking a figure of authority in jest, or wearing a costume that resembled nobility could be accused of disrespect or sedition. Joy became suspicious when it escaped control, and the punishment for joy could be fatal. Even truth was dangerous. Telling the truth in court could lead to death if that truth implicated powerful people or contradicted accepted narratives. Witnesses who spoke honestly sometimes found themselves accused of lying, blasphemy, or conspiracy. In contrast, false testimony was encouraged when it served authority. This created a system where survival depended not on honesty, but alignment. A harmless act like answering a question truthfully could be more dangerous than committing a crime silently. Nature's rhythms were criminalized as well. Falling asleep during sermons, missing bells due to exhaustion, or failing to respond quickly to calls or alarms could be interpreted as neglect or defiance. Human limits, fatigue, illness, confusion were not excuses. The body was expected to obey rules, designed without regard for weakness. When it failed, punishment followed, sometimes with lethal consequences. Over time, fear reshaped morality itself. People learned not to ask whether something was good or bad, kind or cruel, but whether it was permitted. Ethics shrank to obedience. The law did not protect life, it rationed it. Survival became conditional upon conformity so strict that even accidental deviation was intolerable. In the end, medieval crimes that seem harmless today reveal a deeper truth about power and fear. Death was not reserved for the violent, because violence was not the greatest threat. Unpredictability was. Hunger, curiosity, joy, kindness, memory, and truth all represented forces that could not be fully controlled rather than adapt to humanity. Medieval systems tried to erase it, and when people could not erase their own humanity, they were erased instead. Quietly, publicly, and repeatedly, until fear itself became the law that ruled everything. Another often overlooked danger was disagreement without resistance. Simply holding a different opinion, even without acting on it. Medieval society had little tolerance for internal dissent, because belief itself was seen as an action. Thinking differently was assumed to eventually lead to doing differently. If someone expressed uncertainty about a law, a punishment, or a religious interpretation, authorities believed that doubt would spread like disease. The individual did not need to persuade anyone. The mere existence of an alternative viewpoint was considered destabilizing. As a result, quiet disagreement became as punishable as open rebellion, and death was used to eliminate ideas before they could grow. Routine administrative failures could also become lethal. Forgetting to register a birth, marriage, or death, missing a tax deadline, or failing to report livestock accurately could escalate rapidly. These records were tools of control, and errors were treated as deception. A harmless clerical mistake could be interpreted as intentional fraud, especially if it inconvenienced authority. Once accused, the burden of proof fell entirely on the individual, who often lacked the means, literacy, or social standing to defend themselves. Bureaucracy, crude as it was, still killed efficiently. Weather and fate played cruel roles as well. If a storm destroyed crops shortly after someone violated a minor rule, that person could be blamed for angering divine forces. Cause and effect were not logical, they were emotional. People needed explanations for suffering, and explanations required scapegoats. Harmless behavior became retroactively criminal once disaster struck. The crime was not what happened, but when it happened, timing transformed innocence into guilt. The concept of mercy itself was feared. Leaders worried that showing mercy would weaken authority and encourage imitation. As a result, even when guilt was doubtful, punishment proceeded. Sparing one person raised dangerous questions about fairness, and fairness was more threatening than cruelty. Cruelty was predictable. Fairness invited debate. Death silenced debate permanently. Even obedience could backfire. Following orders too eagerly, enforcing laws too strictly, or aligning too closely with authority could later be used as evidence of cruelty. In the medieval world, death often arrived not as a response to cruelty or violence, but as the final answer to fear, uncertainty, and the need for control, turning everyday life into a slow negotiation with invisible boundaries that shifted without warning. What made this reality especially brutal was that people rarely knew which action would condemn them until it was too late. A single word spoken without caution, a moment of hesitation, a look held too long, or a gesture misunderstood could be retroactively transformed into a crime once authority decided it needed an example. Medieval justice did not function as a clear system of rules, but as a living instrument of power, reshaped constantly by famine, plague, war, religious anxiety, and political instability. In such an environment, harmless actions became dangerous because they exposed uncertainty, and uncertainty was the one thing authority could not tolerate. Ordinary people lived under the constant pressure of being interpreted rather than judged. Their actions were not evaluated for intent or harm, but for symbolism. A man standing apart from a crowd might be accused of dissent. A woman speaking confidently might be accused of arrogance or corruption. A family that survived when others perished could be accused of unnatural favour. Even neutrality was dangerous, because refusing to participate in fear-driven rituals, public accusations, punishments, or displays of loyalty suggested independence of thought. Independence itself was treated as a threat, because it implied that obedience was not absolute. Medieval systems relied on predictability, and anything that suggested personal agency disrupted that fragile order. Fear magnified everything. During plagues, illness was not merely a medical condition, but a moral accusation. A cough, a fever, or survival itself could turn suspicion inward. People believed suffering required explanation, and explanation required blame. When crops failed or storms destroyed villages, authorities searched for human causes rather than structural ones. It was easier to kill a person than to confront the randomness of nature. Harmless behavior committed weeks or months earlier could suddenly be reframed as the source of catastrophe, transforming coincidence into guilt and guilt into execution. Speech was especially perilous. Words did not need to be false to be fatal. They only needed to be inconvenient. Telling the truth at the wrong time could destroy a life, if that truth contradicted power. Silence could be just as dangerous, because silence could be interpreted as contempt, secrecy, or agreement with forbidden ideas. People were expected to respond correctly, emotionally and verbally, To every situation, grief, punishment, celebration, prayer, and any deviation risked attention. Once noticed, a person became vulnerable. Attention invited interpretation, interpretation invited accusation, and accusation almost always led to death. The body betrayed people constantly. Fear caused trembling, confusion, tears, or hesitation. And these involuntary reactions were treated as signs of guilt rather than distress. Medieval justice assumed that innocence appeared calm and guilt appeared anxious, ignoring the reality that terror makes everyone appear guilty. Torture only deepened this illusion, extracting confessions that validated fear rather than truth. Once confessed, innocence became irrelevant. The system did not seek accuracy, it sought reassurance. A confession, even false, restored the illusion that disorder had been identified and contained. What made this world especially cruel was how it punished humanity itself. Hunger was treated as moral failure. Exhaustion was treated as laziness. Grief was treated as suspicion. Kindness was treated as conspiracy. Survival was treated as arrogance. Every natural human response carried risk because it suggested needs, emotions, or instincts beyond control. Over time, people learned not to ask whether something was right or wrong, but whether it was safe. Morality collapsed into obedience. Virtue became invisibility. Families were torn apart by this logic. Loyalty to relatives competed with loyalty to authority, and authority always demanded priority. Protecting a loved one could be interpreted as obstruction. Refusing to testify against them could be treated as shared guilt. Testifying truthfully could still lead to punishment if the truth inconvenienced power. In such cases, death did not punish crime. It punished connection. The safest individual was the one with the fewest attachments, the least memory, the smallest presence. Time itself was a weapon. Actions committed years earlier could resurface when circumstances changed. A joke told long ago, a favour granted, a word spoken in trust could become evidence when alliances shifted or fear intensified. The past was never settled, it waited. Memory became dangerous, and forgetting became a survival skill. People learned to live as though nothing they did would ever truly disappear, because in medieval society it never did. The most disturbing aspect of these deaths is how routine they became. Executions were not extraordinary events reserved for extreme crimes. They were administrative tools used to manage anxiety. Killing reassured rulers and frightened populations because it created the appearance of control. Each execution taught the living how narrow the acceptable range of behavior truly was. Over generations, this lesson became instinctive. Children learned silence before speech. Adults learned compliance before conscience. Communities learned suspicion before trust. This system did not collapse under its own cruelty because cruelty was its stabilizing force. Fear made people predictable. Fear made them police themselves and each other. Fear turned neighbours into witnesses, families into informants, and crowds into participants. Violence became normalized, not because people enjoyed it, but because survival depended on accepting it. When death is presented as necessary, resistance feels dangerous and mercy feels irresponsible. What modern eyes recognize as harmless, curiosity, kindness, fatigue, hope, was dangerous precisely because it reminded authority that people were not machines. Human beings adapt, question, feel, and survive in ways that cannot be perfectly controlled. Medieval systems responded to this unpredictability by narrowing acceptable behavior until ordinary life itself became suspect. Death was not the result of moral failure. It was the cost of existing inside a system that valued order more than life. These stories endure because they reveal a truth larger than history. They show what happens when fear governs justice, when power treats humanity as instability, and when control becomes more important than compassion. Medieval crimes that seem harmless today were never truly crimes at all. They were moments where life escaped expectation, where a person spoke, hesitated, helped, endured, remembered, or hoped in a way that could not be neatly contained. In the end, the medieval world teaches a chilling lesson when authority fears uncertainty more than injustice. No action is truly safe. Lines are invisible, rules are flexible, and survival depends not on goodness or innocence, but on remaining unseen. And for countless people, even invisibility was not enough. They died not because they were dangerous, but because they lived in a world where being human was the most dangerous act of all. In that world, fear did not simply punish mistakes, it anticipated them. Medieval justice was preemptive, striking not at harm already done, but at imagined futures that authority found threatening. People were not executed because they had caused disorder, but because they might someday inspire it. A person who spoke too clearly, survived too long, adapted too well, or endured too quietly became a problem, simply by existing outside expectations. The system feared potential more than action, possibility more than evidence. Death erased possibility completely, and that finality made it attractive to those in power. Everyday life was shaped by the understanding that meaning would be imposed on actions regardless of intent. A glance could be interpreted as contempt. A delayed response could be interpreted as resistance. A calm reaction could be interpreted as arrogance. The individual had no control over interpretation, and interpretation was everything. Once an action was framed as symbolic, it no longer belonged to the person who performed it. It belonged to authority, rumor, and fear. From that point on, innocence became irrelevant. Even compliance carried risk. Obedience had to be performed correctly, visibly, and consistently. Too much obedience looked suspicious, as if someone were trying to hide something. Too little obedience looked defiant. The acceptable middle was narrow and constantly shifting. People were expected to sense changes in mood, power, and expectation without being told. Failing to anticipate these shifts was treated as negligence or insolence. Survival required intuition more than morality, and intuition failed often. The law's greatest strength was its vagueness. Rules were written or spoken broadly, allowing authorities to define crimes after the fact. Terms like disorder, impropriety, heresy, or defiance could be stretched to include nearly any behavior. This flexibility ensured that no one could ever feel secure. Certainty would have allowed resistance. Uncertainty ensured obedience. When people cannot predict punishment, they adapt by shrinking their lives. Communal life intensified this danger. People lived close together, watched constantly, and depended on one another for survival. This dependency turned fear outward, Reporting others became a form of self-defense. Accusation was safer than silence. Over time, communities learned that someone must always be blamed when fear rose. In the medieval world, many actions that appear harmless or even trivial by modern standards were treated as grave offences, not because of their inherent danger, but because they threatened social order, religious authority, or feudal control, and the consequences could be horrifyingly final. A poorly chosen word, a missed obligation, or a moment of desperation could spiral into accusations that carried the ultimate punishment. One such crime was poaching a rabbit or deer from a lord's forest, an act that today might be dismissed as survival or hunger-driven theft, but in medieval Europe was considered a direct attack on noble privilege. Forests were symbols of power, and killing game without permission challenged the hierarchy itself, leading not only to imprisonment, but sometimes execution, mutilation, or death from exposure after public punishment. Similarly, cutting down a tree or collecting fallen wood could be labelled theft if the land belonged to the wrong authority, even if the offender only sought warmth or shelter. Another seemingly minor act was failing to show proper deference, forgetting to bow, remove a hat, or address a superior correctly could be interpreted as defiance, especially during periods of unrest. And defiance was often treated as treason in miniature, punishable by torture or death, to make an example of the offender. Speech itself was dangerous. Careless jokes, rumours, or complaints about taxes, food shortages, or local officials could be framed as sedition or heresy, especially when the church and state were deeply intertwined. A farmer muttering that God seemed unjust during a famine could be accused of blasphemy, a charge that frequently ended at the stake, while a tavern conversation repeating hearsay about a king's weakness might be enough to bring the gallows. Even silence could be fatal. Refusing to answer questions in a court, often out of fear or confusion, might be seen as guilt or contempt, resulting in brutal coercion such as pressing, where victims were slowly crushed under stones until they spoke or died. Clothing choices also carried lethal risk. Wearing fabrics, colours, or styles reserved for nobility violated sumptuary laws designed to enforce class boundaries, and while some punishments were fines, repeated offences or refusal to comply could escalate into imprisonment and death, particularly if authorities suspected broader disobedience. Economic survival was equally perilous. Baking bread that was too small, watering down ale, or selling goods at the wrong price could be treated as fraud, and public punishments, like the pillory, exposed offenders to violence, disease, and starvation, sometimes killing them indirectly, but no less certainly. Women were especially vulnerable, as everyday behaviours could be reframed as moral crimes. Midwives, herbalists, or widows living alone could attract suspicion simply for existing outside male control, and an accusation of witchcraft, often rooted in jealousy, fear, or misfortune, required little evidence to justify execution. Even domestic disputes could turn deadly. Shouting at a spouse or neighbour might be labelled disorderly conduct, but if the wrong person felt challenged, it could be recast as an insult to honour or authority, leading to harsh penalties. Children were not exempt either. Stealing food, skipping church, or playing games deemed immoral could result in corporal punishment so severe that it caused permanent injury or death, justified as moral correction. Religious life offered no refuge, as failing to attend church, breaking fasts, or observing rituals incorrectly could be treated as signs of heresy. And heresy was considered worse than murder because it endangered souls and social unity. Once accused, medieval justice offered little protection. Trials were brief, evidence was often irrelevant, and confessions extracted under torture were accepted as truth, meaning that even innocent people could be condemned for acts that barely register as wrongdoing today. Execution methods themselves were meant to reinforce fear. Hanging, burning, beheading, or being broken on the wheel were public spectacles designed to warn others that obedience mattered more than intent. In this world, the line between life and death was thin and arbitrary, shaped not by fairness, but by power, tradition, and fear. What makes these crimes so disturbing is not only the brutality of the punishments, but the realization that ordinary people, hungry, tired, frightened, or simply careless, could lose their lives for actions that modern societies would barely notice. Medieval law was less about justice and more about control, and death was not reserved for monstrous acts, but used as a tool to enforce obedience in a fragile and unequal world, where survival itself often meant walking constantly on the edge of fatal transgression. In many regions, even movement itself could become a fatal mistake, as travelling without proper permission or documentation was often viewed with deep suspicion. A peasant leaving their village in search of work, food, or safety might be accused of vagrancy, a crime rooted less in harm and more in fear of disorder. Vagrants were believed to spread disease, crime, and rebellion, and authorities often punished them harshly to deter others from abandoning their assigned place in the social structure. Arrest could lead to whipping, branding, forced labour, or execution, especially during times of famine or plague, when fear ruled decision-making. Crossing a boundary, stepping onto the wrong lord's land, walking through a restricted road, or entering a town after curfew, could trigger similar outcomes, not because the act itself was dangerous, but because boundaries symbolized control, and violating them challenged the invisible lines that held medieval society together. Even hospitality could turn deadly. Sheltering a stranger without permission might be interpreted as aiding a criminal or spy, and households accused of such kindness could face collective punishment. Medical ignorance also transformed harmless behavior into lethal crimes. During outbreaks of disease, especially plagues, people who appeared sick, behaved oddly, or simply survived when others died could be accused of deliberately spreading illness. Touching a well feeding animals or washing clothes in the wrong place might be framed as poisoning, a charge that almost always led to execution. In desperate attempts to explain suffering, communities searched for scapegoats, and everyday actions were reinterpreted through paranoia and fear. Grief itself was dangerous. Public mourning that seemed excessive or unnatural could attract suspicion of witchcraft or guilt, particularly for women, whose emotional expression was closely scrutinized. Likewise, laughter at inappropriate moments, nervous behavior, or failure to cry could all be twisted into evidence of moral corruption. Debt was another silent killer. Borrowing small sums to survive a poor harvest or illness could spiral into accusations of fraud or breach of trust. If repayment failed, medieval prisons were not designed for rehabilitation. They were filthy, overcrowded, and deadly, and many people sentenced for minor financial disputes died of disease, starvation, or neglect before any formal execution was necessary. Even attempting to negotiate or protest unfair debts could be treated as defiance of authority escalating the punishment. Markets, meant to sustain life, became stages of fatal error, using the wrong weights, measuring grain incorrectly, or trading on an unauthorized day could result in punishment so severe that survival was unlikely. Honor culture made words sharper than weapons. Insults, even accidental ones, could provoke legal action or personal vengeance supported by the courts. Calling someone a liar, questioning lineage, or mocking appearance might seem trivial, but such words attacked reputation, which in medieval society was a form of survival currency. Loss of honor could mean loss of protection, and accusations of slander could lead to trials that ended in execution, particularly if the insult involved clergy or nobility. In some cases, simply failing to defend one's honor, remaining silent after an accusation, was seen as admission of guilt, again showing how restraint itself could become deadly. Time also worked against the accused. Legal delays were not safeguards, they were punishments. Being held while awaiting judgment could be more dangerous than the sentence itself, as weeks or months in confinement often ended in death from illness or mistreatment. Appeals rarely helped common people, and mercy depended entirely on the mood or interests of those in power. A harmless act committed during a calm period might be ignored, while the same act during unrest could be punished with death to restore a sense of control. Justice shifted with politics, weather, harvests, and rumour. What ties all these stories together is the absence of proportionality. Medieval law was not built to weigh intent, context, or humanity. It was built to preserve hierarchy. Death was not the last resort, but a warning, a message carved into bodies and displayed in public spaces. Harmless actions became symbols of imagined threats, and individuals were sacrificed to maintain the illusion of order. For most people, survival required constant vigilance, obedience, and invisibility, because standing out, even accidentally, could mean crossing an unseen line. In such a world, the most dangerous crimes were not acts of violence or cruelty, but ordinary human behaviors performed at the wrong moment, in the wrong place, or under the wrong authority, turning daily life itself into a gamble, where the smallest mistake could cost everything. Another layer of danger lay in communal responsibility, where an individual's harmless action could doom an entire household or village. Medieval law often operated on collective guilt. Even leisure and rest were closely watched, and